Welcome to OptimalLiving.com. Today I'm going to be trying something new out where I'm going to be talking about certain subjects in an audio form rather than just writing, because I understand that some people don't care to read. So I'm going to try it out. If you like it, be sure to let me know, and I can do this more in the future. So today, the topic that we're going to be talking about is high-intensity interval training. This primarily pertains to the cardiovascular form of high-intensity training. So what actually is high-intensity training? It's a form of cardio that is basically, as the name suggests, very high intensity. And when I say high intensity, I mean it's very brief bouts, usually anywhere from 6 to 30 seconds, a very high intensity exercise. And that could include something like sprinting on a bike, increasing the resistance on a stationary bike, or sprinting up a hill. Pretty much any form of cardiovascular exercise. So why do people actually do it? Well, there's this big argument that's been going on for years now in the training the training field, and that's that high intensity interval training is superior to steady state forms of cardio. So why do people actually think that this is the case? Well, there's a long-withstanding belief, which it probably is true, is that steady-state cardio actually decreases the amount of muscle that you can carry on your body. The reason for this is because there's a certain amount of adaptations that can happen inside of a muscle, and things such as resistance training and cardiovascular training have conflicting adaptations. And in your muscle, there's only a certain amount of space. So as one adaptation increases, such as you get better at doing cardiovascular type exercises, there's a thought that there has to be an opposite decrease in resistance training adaptations. So people started doing high intensity interval training because we were starting to find that you could get similar adaptations in terms of fat oxidation and cardiovascular benefits without having to sacrifice your lean muscle mass. Most people do cardio exercises unless they're an ultra endurance athlete or an endurance athlete on its own. A lot of people do cardio under the pretense that they'll lose body fat. So the thought behind high intensity training is that you can get the same benefit, but through doing much less volume and doing it in a shorter amount of time. So what's actually special about high intensity interval training is that while during the actual training session it might be very short and you don't actually increase a lot of fat burning, what happens is over time throughout the day for close to 24 hours, you actually increase the amount of fat that your body is burning. Whereas steady state cardio, traditionally, there's a high amount of fat that's burned during the session, but later on a decrease in the amount of fat that you're burning throughout the day. So this is the thought as to why high intensity training is superior. So what's actually special about high intensity training? It's thought that it's muscle sparing, meaning that you don't lose a lot of muscle when you do it, and there's some evidence to suggest that you can actually increase lean body mass. It reduces the amount of time that you have to spend doing it. Less volume, meaning when you do steady state cardio, you have to run or walk at a low intensity for a pretty significant amount of time. Whereas high intensity interval training typically is something like 3 to 10 bouts of 10-second all-out sprints. Another thing that it might actually benefit is, especially for athletes, it might allow them to run and train or perform during their respective sport at a higher intensity for longer periods of time. So that's a really beneficial thing for an athlete. So what are some of the important concerns about about high intensity interval training? Well, for me, the biggest thing that you have to worry about is that high intensity interval training is actually really difficult. A lot of people misunderstand what high intensity interval training is. Some people, when they hear interval training, what that comes off to them as is that I should run for a minute and then walk for 30 seconds, or run a little bit harder and then jog for 30 seconds. That's not what a traditional high intensity interval training session is. A high intensity interval training session is actually extremely high intensity for a short burst of time. So it's literally you are training as hard as you can for something like 10 seconds. There's actually a thing that a lot of research uses, and I've been able to experience this. It's called a Wingate machine. And what happens is, for a certain amount of seconds, you sprint all out under no resistance. And once the bike reaches a certain RPM, a certain percentage of your body weight drops and it's added as resistance to the bike. So you're now pedaling at a very high rate under resistance, and you have to fight against that resistance, and eventually your muscle just stops and you have to take a break for however long you need. It's very difficult to do, and a lot of people don't actually understand this. So if you're ever considering doing high intensity interval training, you have to recognize that it's a very difficult task. That being said, the biggest concern that I have is that it could certainly have an impact on your recovery. If you're training very hard in the gym and potentially not eating enough, a lot of people who incorporate cardio are actually in a dieting phase where they're reducing the amount of calories they're taking in. This, in my opinion, could have a significant effect on your ability to train and your ability to recover. So if you've ever considered doing this or are considering doing it, you should definitely keep this in mind, because it could certainly have an impact on your performance, your mood, your ability to actually train, which nobody wants that. So with that being said, I'm going to move on to a Reddit question that relates to high intensity interval training. It's kind of what actually got me into thinking about this subject, that people were thinking about, and I'm going to read it for you now. Man, I knew it sounded too good to be true. Same amount of calories lost in a fraction of time a jog takes. Cool stuff. I did it 3 or 4 times now and almost puked the first time and quit my other attempts a little earlier so I don't feel awful again. Yet, I felt nausea every single time with varying degrees of intensity. I honestly can't do it. I can run 10 kilometers in roughly an hour on the treadmill, but I frankly feel more like quitting out of boredom than exhaustion more often than not. I did a routine in which I'm supposed to hop onto a wind bike, ride with highest intensity for 15 seconds, then 60 seconds break, and do it 10 times. Turns out my stomach gives in before I can even get to the end of the program. What should I do about this? I took this as a very interesting question, because this is actually something that I've experienced in the past. There have been times where I got a sudden burst of motivation that I should start doing high intensity interval training, and I did it, and I started off doing like 4 or 5 rounds of 10-second sprints. And while it may, on the surface, not sound like a lot, when you do that sort of high-intensity training, it's extremely difficult. And the funny thing is about that sort of training is a lot of times while you're doing it, you feel really bad. It's very difficult to do, but the nausea doesn't actually set in for about 10 minutes after you're done. There's been multiple different times where I've attempted to do this sort of training, and it honestly has made me feel the worst that I've ever felt in my life. So, as with anything, especially resistance training or cardiovascular training, my suggestion is if you ever are considering to do this, you first have to recognize that it's not easy. It's very difficult to do. And if you complete your first couple high-intensity interval training sets and you don't feel like it's one of the worst things you've ever done in your life, you're not doing it right, and you need to do it harder. Otherwise, you're not actually getting the benefit that you're hoping to get. Second, I would suggest start very slow. And by that I mean what you should do is you should pick something like a 6-second sprint and you should do it once and then go home. You could do this at the end of your training session. I wouldn't suggest doing it before you resistance train because it's very difficult. But that's all you really need, especially if you're not used to doing it. The adaptation will occur, and the next time that you come in, you'll be able to do a little bit more. And as simple of an answer as it is, what you should do is steadily and slowly increase the time that you spend during the sprint. You can decrease the amount of time you spend in between sets, and you can increase the amount of sets that you do. But you should do it slowly. So the next time you come in, try doing 2 6-second sprints, or try and do 1 10-second sprints. However you want to look at it, you can just increase the amount that you're doing or decrease the time that you're spending doing it, but go slow. Because if you try and do more than you're actually capable of, you'll end up being sick, and then you'll end up being frustrated and not want to do it anymore. So with that being said, I think that about wraps this section up for now. If you have questions or comments, be sure to comment below. If you like this format and would like to hear more, be sure to like, share, and comment below again. With that, I leave you with a quote. Science knows no country, because knowledge belongs to humanity, and is the torch which illuminates the world. Science is the highest personification of the nation, because that nation will remain the first which carries the furthest the works of thought and intelligence. Louis Pasteur. Thanks. Until next time, question everything.